everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy, where we find ourselves May 9th, 2023. Get subscribed here to my YouTube channel if you have not yet, and hop over to jaaaronsimmons.com and get signed up for my monthly newsletter. I would very much appreciate you doing both. Today, I want to take up an idea, a thought, that was pitched to me, suggested to me by a friend of mine, the philosopher Michau. And what he suggested was that I make a video reflecting on the notion of living without a why. Now, there's two basic ideas here that we can unpack, two different ways of making sense of what it means to live without a why. The first we might call existential, and the second we'll call ethical. This idea of existentially living without a why is actually something that can be rather troubling. So think, for example, of the idea that we need some sort of purpose or meaning to what it is we do. We've got to think that what we do matters, that there's a significance to our efforts, our activity, our beliefs, our very existence itself. So living without a why in regard to this generally existential approach can actually be something that slides into what I would describe as a kind of absurdism. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some have argued, like Albert Camus, Samuel Beckett, and others, that living in the face of the absurdity of existence is maybe something that gives meaning to life. Precisely in our living, we are engaging in a kind of act of resistance, that the absurdity of reality is not overwhelming. It doesn't destroy us. It doesn't defeat us. And so in that sense, living without a why in this sort of absurdist existential sense might be a compelling way to go in those moments where we feel like that there really is no easy way to see why it all matters, what the point really is. However, it's also important to understand, as philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and others suggest, that we can do almost anything so long as we have a why for doing it. And in this sense, I think it's important to take up the value of living with a why, that existentially, purpose really does propel us. It moves us forward. And purpose here doesn't have to be some objective reality, an objective sense of absolute truth or capital R reason, but instead merely the idea that it makes a difference that we continue to do the best we can, that there's a value to excellence itself, that there's something important named in our very effort to care about importance. That idea is what we find, interestingly, in Camus' essay Myth of Sisyphus, where we find Sisyphus rolling his rock up the hill, and Camus says at one point, so long as Sisyphus has his rock, he has his thing, he has a reason to keep moving. We all need that thing, that why. Even if it turns out that our why is a resistance to the absurdity, I would suggest that that still ends up being a kind of why, even in the face of an absurd existence without why. So existentially, I'm on the side of those who suggest we do need purpose, we do need meaning, we do need some reason for doing what we do, even if that reason is just because our doing it says something about who we hope to become, about the kinds of beings we are. Now, that said, the alternative to this sort of existential approach, which I've suggested does need a why, is what we might call the ethical reading of living without a why. On the ethical model of thinking about living without a why, I think that actually the opposite occurs from what we saw in the existential sense. On the ethical version, we can differentiate between intrinsic and instrumental value theories. Intrinsic just means that something matters because it matters. There's no why behind it. There's no in order to. Instrumental value theories are fundamentally committed to an in order to logic. We do something in order to bring about something else. Now, on this model, and this is actually what I think that Michau was suggesting to me, is thinking about the moral value, the weight that attaches to not always being defined by an instrumentalist approach to living. Too often we think There's no reason to do something unless we're going to get paid for it, unless we're going to get some sort of reward. Unless there's an incentive to be excellent, why even care? Why even try unless we can win? Well, part of what we've seen in some philosophers recently, we talked about Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida and even others like Anne Lamott, have all suggested and invited us to consider the real value that attaches to doing things because we want to be the sorts of people who do those things. Just because they matter in our very doing them, not because they yield some instrumentalist outcome. This is what I often refer to as faithfulness rather than success. It's about being invested in faithfully navigating life rather than successfully having lived. It's about wanting to be propelled forward towards what matters instead of checking the box of having achieved something that others can celebrate and praise. Intrinsic value is living without a why. Emmanuel Levinas, in fact, says at one point that faith is ultimately a matter of living without a why, such that we recognize the value of love without reward. Think about how different that would be if we approached things like religion, not in order to get to heaven, not in order to gain eternal life, but because it matters that we live lives reflecting holiness, reflecting faithfulness. Imagine what it would look like to be committed to justice, not so that we win some particular election or that we gain certain types of power, not even such that we can celebrate having achieved justice, though that's good, but simply because it matters to be the sorts of people who love justice, who work toward justice, not as a thing to enact, though again, that's awesome, but as a thing that pulls us ever deeper in relation to the other. Living without a why, existentially, I think is very hard to pull off. But ethically, living without a why, I find very compelling indeed. Living without a why means investing ourselves in beauty, truth, and goodness for their own sake. And to close, maybe I'll tell you a little story of how this might work out. Years and years ago, I was in a museum in Europe. I actually forget which museum it was. I think it was the National Gallery of London, but it might have been the Louvre. I forget. And I was there, and the docent was taking us through and talking about different paintings. And there was this one painting where the bottom right-hand corner was in a very noticeably different style than the rest of the painting. And the docent went into saying, what explains this? And it was the artist had done most of the painting, came back several years later to finish it up, had changed his style. And so what we see here is a painting that marks this transition in his progression as an artist. And I raised my hand and said, well, what evidence do we have that that's true? In other words, do we have record of the artist claiming that this is what occurred? And the docent didn't have a good answer really to this, but just said, no, this, it makes sense. It explains why we see such a radical difference. And I said, well, but couldn't it also be the case that the artist did this because it looks cool? Just because playing with beauty in a different way is worth doing. And the docent was really taken aback and actually kind of offended that I was so blue collar and lowbrow and didn't appreciate the great, esteem of this artistic theory. And look, the docent may have been right, but the idea that we always have to have a why, maybe beauty is a why enough. Maybe goodness is a why enough for us. And in that sense, I think that maybe living intrinsically without a why, living ethically without a why, throws us back onto the existential why that compels us in the first place. Because truth, beauty, and goodness matter. Because virtue is worthwhile. Because excellence is valuable. Not for something else, but for its own sake. And that our lives, committed faithfully to these sorts of things, are lives worth living indeed. Regardless of our social status, our public power, our political influence. It matters because we are the sorts of people who make it matter. I think that is itself worthwhile. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. I think the over-examined life is unlivable. But maybe living intentionally without a why ethically can throw us into an existential why that is sufficient to keep us going. So, thanks to Michau for suggesting this idea, this topic for the video. If any of the rest of you have suggestions for videos you would like me to make, that you would like me to take up and consider from a philosophical point of view, drop a comment, reach out to me by email. Anything I can do, I would love to do it. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.